And so today we are fortunate to continue this conversation and explore the impacts of slavery upon American society, even still today. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Father Walter to introduce Jody more properly than I have, and to open us with prayer.
Thank you, Father Drew. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Also with you. We'll pray today this prayer for the human family. Oh God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in harmony around your heavenly throne, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jody Lynn Allen. Professor Allen, as Father Drew said, is a professor at William and Mary. She is a native Virginian from the Hampton, Virginia, the Tidewater area, which is quite historic and famous. She is also taught me this past summer when I was taking a course online at Sewanee. She was part of a team of historians, and one church historian and two sort of more secular historians who on the issue of the Episcopal Church, race, and slavery. And so she was a logical person for me to reach out to for this particular topic. As I said, born and raised in Virginia. She actually, I'll say this, she's a graduate of Hampton High School. And I only say that because later in the year, you will have the Reverend Chuck Winder, who is also from Hampton, who attended the arch rival high school of Bethel High School. I learned from Jody yesterday. And Chuck is an old friend, and he will give you a talk later in the year, which will be quite good. Jody attended the University of Delaware for her bachelor's, and then she actually came to East Lansing, Michigan, to Michigan State University for an MS in criminal justice, interestingly enough. Her husband actually, I'm putting this in for all the Michigan fans out there, since y'all ducked playing Ohio State this year, that Jody got her master's in criminal justice at Michigan State, and her husband played football for Michigan State, and that's how they met during that time. But she got hooked into history from there and ended up going back to Virginia and earning her PhD in history at William and Mary. She is finishing a manuscript on a book, which is a great title, called Roses in December, Black Life in Hanover County, Virginia during the era of disenfranchisement, which talks about the disenfranchisement of African-American males in the voting in Virginia, 1902. And she's also working on a documentary film about school desegregation in Kent County, Virginia. And she works on, besides teaching history, she works on a project at William and Mary called the Lemon Project, which I think she'll talk about. The Lemon Project, A Journey of Reconciliation. And I believe she's going to talk a bit about that, so I'll leave that to her. And so without any other questions or comments, I'm just turning it over to Professor Allen, and thank you for being here.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and it's nice to online meet all of you. Got to come up with language for this, this new form of meeting people. I'm going to talk, as Father Walter said, I'm going to talk about the Lemon Project and how, what we're doing at William and Mary and what other colleges and universities are doing to correct what I consider the miseducation of America. And I'm also going to, set my timer so that I don't talk over into your time to ask questions. But again, when I say the miseducation of America, we have been really since the end of the Civil War and the development of the Lost Cause, miseducated in many ways about slavery in this country, the realities of slavery in this country. And I think that is a large part of the reason that we have these enduring problems in this country, because we've continued to sweep the very foundation of our country, the economic, the social foundation of our country, which was slavery, under the rug. I kind of think of it as when you have an infection and you don't take all of the antibiotics, you don't do all the medicine, and eventually it always bubbles back up to the top. And so I think until we really deal with it, it's going to continue to bubble back up to the top. And we're going to have to eventually deal with it. And hopefully that's what's happening at this time, again, as I said, on college and university campuses. Now, I'll give you a little bit of background on how this movement, which I think it's become a movement, started. In 2003, Ruth Simmons, who was the first African-American to be president of an Ivy League school. She became president of Brown University. And I'm sorry, she became president in 2001, but in 2003, she established a commission for asking Brown to look into its history with slavery and the slave trade. And while Brown University never owned or enslaved people, the Brown family, which funded and it had the name Rhode Island College, was changed to Brown, made their money, their fortune on the slave trade. And so she wanted to uncover that history and began to think about what the university could or needed to do to address that history. And so that report came out in 2006. And if you're interested, you can go to the Brown website and see the report. In 2007, and a lot of people don't think about this, but William and Mary was founded in 1693. And when you think in hindsight, of course, slavery was involved. But it was something, again, that had been swept under the rug at William and Mary. And in 2007, there was a student who heard mention of the possibility that William and Mary had once owned slaves. And so she happened to also be a member of the student assembly, which is a student government, and put a resolution before the student assembly, which was passed after some changes. But the decision was that they called on William and Mary to study its full history, to make that history public, and to establish a memorial to the enslaved. And so the next year, let me finish this. The next year, the faculty passed a similar resolution. And in 2009, they brought in a man named Robert Ames, who was a historian of the area, but at the time was teaching at Penn. And he did a semester-long study. They found out what was in the list, what kind of information was in the archives, and he wrote a report to the Board of Visitors. And the Board of Visitors passed a resolution in 2009 acknowledging that William and Mary had owned slaves. Also, though, they took it a step further and also acknowledged that William and Mary had done nothing to challenge the tenets of Jim Crow or legal segregation. And that William and Mary had not been a good neighbor to its the African American community. And so then they established the Lemon Project, a journey of reconciliation. And it was supposed to be an 8-year archival research project. But one of the things we learned or realized right off the bat was that we could not go into the archives after having announced that William and Mary was finally going to deal with the issues of race around the university and go into an archive then for 8 years. And even if we came out with a Pulitzer Prize winning book, by that point, the community would have once again thought William and Mary said something it was going to do and dropped the ball. And so we began the archival research, but we also began community engagement, community outreach, asking the African-American community what they wanted, what they needed, what they thought William and Mary's role should be. We started having events in the community. And so we are now, this has now, as I said, William and Mary was a second institution to establish and fund a program like this. Now there are well over 60 schools in this country, in the UK, and in the Caribbean, all looking at these same or similar questions about slavery and its legacies. So what I want to do is I'm going to show you, I'm going to share my screen and show you a few slides. As a student, based on the student resolution, we did do archival research. So I'm going to show you some of the things that we found. We are getting the word out to the community, and we are establishing a memorial to the enslaved. So let me share. Okay. Okay, you would think after a semester and a half of teaching on Zoom, I would have gotten this straight. Okay, I think you're seeing it now.
Yes, we do.
Okay, good. Okay, so this first document I want to show you, and it's to tell you all of the kind of historic looking records you're seeing. They all were found in the bursar's records. The one thing that if they didn't keep track of anything else, they kept track of their money. And so all of this is one of the reasons we know some of the things we know about the enslaved people. This was a list from 1780 that includes the names of 21 people. And you see the list it's kind of divided in half. The top of the list tends to just give you the name and maybe the condition of the person. So you'll see Wingfield, Daniel, Dick, who's listed as almost an invalid. Then you go down to Old Lucy is an invalid, Old Kate an invalid, Nanny the same, and then Effie not much better. Okay. Now at the bottom of the list, it says Negroes hired out. And after the Revolution, William and Mary, during and after the Revolution, when all that English money stopped coming into the colony, they needed, they couldn't afford to maintain as many enslaved people. And so they sometimes hired their enslaved people out, and that's how they made some money. And you'll notice on this list, there's Lemon, James, Letty, Charlotte, Betty. There were 2 Geralds. And Lemon, in the record, we know the most about him. And so that's how the project got its name. And we know that Lemon sometimes apparently grew produce that he was then he was able to sell back to the college. So in some ways he was a vendor to the college occasionally. We know that Lemon and a few others got what they called in the record one Christmas, a Christmas bonus. Around 1815, we know that they bought Lemon medicine. In 1817, they bought his coffin. And so while this is a very piddly amount to know about a human being, we know the most about him. And again, but he represents all of the known and the unknown, the named and the unnamed enslaved people at William and Mary. The second list is a list of payments of different categories of people. At the top, they list scholars. And these are all white boys who attended the college, and this is what they paid in fees. Now, William and Mary also had, and actually in its earliest days, had what they call the Indian School. And it was a school for Indian boys to come, and the charter of the school says that they were there to propagate amongst Western Indians Christianity. Okay. So there's the names of the boys, the Indian boys. And then at the bottom, you see Negroes. Students were allowed to bring their body servants to campus, but they had to pay a fee. And so you see on this list, unfortunately, none of the boys are named. They're named by the person who owns them. So you have Graham's boy, Braxton's boy, Carter's boy, and so on. But in the fees that were paid, so they could come to William and Mary with their master, so to speak. This final document, bursar's record, is from William and Mary, also owned in 1718, purchased a plantation and purchased 17 people to work that plantation. It was a tobacco plantation, and the money to be raised, was to be used to pay for their tuition or scholarships for, as the record says, less wealthy white males. Also to pay for the upkeep of the campus. And at the bottom here, on December 12th, you'll see that once again, it appears that there was a vendor type relationship between some of the enslaved and the college, because you see that says paid Nottoway Negroes for hops. Now, Nottoway Quarter was the name of the plantation. Okay. Okay. Now, this list is 1777. Again, as I said, as the British money ceased to flow into the colonies, William and Mary needed to sell some things. And so by this point, the number of enslaved people at Nottoway Quarter, it says about 30. And this is an ad that the bursar put out announcing a sale of slaves that was going to happen at Nottoway Quarter. And there were approximately 30 people. They were also looking to sell or possibly lease the land. Okay. One of the interesting sources of our finding out about some of the enslaved people has been in the Bruton Parish church records. There was a belief that it was a responsibility of Christian owners to teach, to Christianize the enslaved, just as they said they needed to Christianize the Indians. And this was not, in the early days of the colony, British law did not accommodate for slavery. And so if you became a Christian, that in the earliest days, you could then become free. At some point in the colony, in the 18th century, that changed. Within the colonies, you could become Christian, but that did not lead to freedom. But baptizing was very important, because that was not for the enslaved person as much as it was for the white owner. Their ticket into heaven was to Christianize their enslaved people. And so one of the things, and they would take them to Bruton Parish, they paid a fee, and they were listed in the baptismal records. And so one of the other things that we learned from these records is that William and Mary also enslaved families. And here you'll see where Tom Mask, son of Molly belonging to the college, Molly also had 4 daughters, Phyllis, Belinda, Jenny, and Elizabeth. Now, interestingly, in these records, because this is not the only family we find, but in none of these records is there a mention of the father. So we don't know in any case who the fathers were. Okay. Now, this is a list of the enslaved people that we have found listed in the record. You see many of them are, we have what I refer to as sightings. We see a mention of a person, but there's no name. Like the person may have run an errand, or they may have said something, to a person, but they're just not named, but they let you know that it's an enslaved person. In some cases, we know, like, for example, the unnamed wheelwright, the unnamed woodcutter, an unnamed glazier, and so on. But we do have some names, and they're also listed here. And I'll tell you the significance of, right now we're at 190 names that we've found, okay? Or again, sightings. Okay, so the second part, if you recall, of the student resolution was to make it public. Don't keep this story hidden. And so these are just some of the ways that we are making it public. These presentations, like I'm talking to you today, but also engaging in the local community. We have annual symposia every year to share with people what we found. But we also have members of the community who come in and talk about their family history, because again, remember, while we're starting with slavery, that is not the end of our story. It's just the key place where we need to begin, because that's where we began in this country. Also through social media, we have a report of the first 8 years. And we do presentations, again, at the local, state, national, and international levels, and then in the press. Okay. So this is the third part of the student resolution, the memorial to the enslaved. And we started working on this in 2014. I co-taught a class with a local architect who also teaches at William and Mary. And that class was a mix of traditional undergrads, community members, graduate students, and 2 staff people were a part of that class. We wanted it to be a mix of people. And that class was to be taught in fall of 2014. In spring, there was a committee that came out of that class to begin the work of establishing a memorial at William and Mary. Now, I will tell you that it took us from 2015 until the spring of 2018 to get this approved. If you know anything about William and Mary, like I said, it's almost 328 years old, and there's something called what's come to be known as the historic campus. And that's the campus, the original campus. And some people consider it, and literally I've heard it referred to as holy ground. And we were told constantly that there would never be a memorial there. And one of the reasons that we decided that we were going to stick out this and fight as long as we needed to was because that was where the enslaved people lived and worked, right? And so we were concerned that anywhere else, this was going to be then the fight of the next generation. Why is the memorial over in that corner? Or it doesn't make sense. Why wasn't it, And we had to, the fact that this is considered too holy to really talk about slavery. And again, that's one of the problems. They never talked about the fact that everyone lived in that one building. There was something called, there is still there, the main college building. The faculty, the president, the students, and the enslaved people all lived in that building. Okay, they interacted daily in that building. But again, there's no mention of this in any of the previous histories of William and Mary. It was completely erased. And so anyway, so it took us finally in 2018, the administration agreed that it could be on the historic campus. And so the next battle was that we wanted to have an idea competition and not a traditional RFP. We wanted anybody and everybody to be able to submit to this competition. And so we got past that battle. And then, so fall of 2018, the competition was announced. We got 84 submissions, 4 of which were not eligible for different reasons. And so 4 continents represented. We had a jury of 9 people, and they consisted of alums. Actually, one of the architects who worked on the African American History Museum at the Smithsonian. Another person who was the curator of African American history at that museum at the Smithsonian, and a current undergrad. And so it was a real broad range of people. It was a completely blind process. They went into a room, they selected the top 3, which were submitted to the president, and she selected this one, which is called Hearth. We're hoping to break ground in the spring. And one of the reasons we've been working so hard to find names is because we required that any design have a mechanism for including the names of the enslaved people. And so the names of the 190 people, and the second requirement was that there would be ways for us to continue to add names as the research continues. And so this is another angle. So I'm going to stop sharing here. And I guess just go ahead and open, well, I'll turn it over to Father Walter and how you want to, start the discussion or the Q&A.
Thank you, Jody. So Father Drew and I, so the next section is Father Drew and I will just do a bit of dialogue, and then
Okay.
Our responders will join in after that a bit, if that's okay. So I just first want to just add, this is a proud parent moment. As the parent of a Brown graduate who was a student when Ruth Simmons was at Brown. In fact, he was in the last class his graduating class was 2012 when Ruth stepped down as president after about 10 or 11 years. I can't remember how long. She didn't quite retire. Her plan was, this is just interesting, her plan was to, after taking a year off, go back and teach in her original discipline, which I believe is French literature, if I'm not mistaken. However, it's most interesting, she decided to become president of an HBCU in Texas, Prairie View University, which is quite interesting. The question I guess I want to first ask, am I freezing again?
You're fine.
Okay, okay, thank you. How much, I guess, how did you as a group handle the resistance that would naturally come? And I say this because Virginia, well, for those who don't, I know some of you all know Virginia quite well. I spent quite a bit of time there and lived there for a bit. And if you go particularly to Richmond, you understand something. The capital for Richmond and the architecture, it all looks like Washington, D.C. And for me, that seems like this idea that they truly view themselves in Virginia as the founders of the nation. Of course, with Jefferson, Washington, Madison, and so on. But in that context, then there's a discomfort that I have noticed around in confronting all of history as opposed to the sanitized version. So how did you all deal with the resistance to this or criticism that would come? I'm curious to know, how did that dialogue transpire?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, and certainly in Richmond and in large parts of Virginia, the Confederacy also still reigns kind of sacrosanct. And so we just honestly, with the class, one of the, we had different visitors to the class. We invited the vice president for advancement to come and talk with us about how you would go about raising money for a memorial. The president came to the very last class where the students had designed their own idea of what the memorial should be. And they had written a proposal to the Board of Visitors. And so the president came to class and observed their presentations. And so we tried again, from the beginning. The executive director of the historic campus came, and she was new and she was very much in favor of what we were trying to do. But so we tried from the very beginning to get the word out that this is something that's coming. And we just kept, every time we would write up a proposal and we'd go to the administration, and it would get knocked down. We didn't stop. We just came back and made some changes and took it back to him. And one of the interesting things that, and I'll be honest, I got really frustrated. And this is about probably 2017, early 2018. And I just said one day in a meeting, so you're saying they weren't acceptable here when they were living here, and they're still not acceptable. Is that the message you want to send? And the next meeting, you could have knocked me out. The very next meeting, it was approved. But that was several years of, back and forth, and just showing that we weren't going to give up. And then again, like I said, the next step, if any of you have worked with procurement, I think procurement is challenging no matter where you are, and the way we wanted to do the competition was something that procurement didn't quite understand. They understood putting out the call for proposals, this is what we want, blah, 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 that. And so that took a while, but that eventually got worked out. It's again, I think it was just persistence. Also, I don't, as I said earlier, probably it was spring, I think, of 2016. Some of us, there were a few of us in Virginia who were starting to have these conversations and starting to do this work. And we talked about there should be kind of a consortium where we get together periodically and talk about, what's going on our campuses and supporting each other. And so we, initially it was called Virginia Colleges and Universities Studying Slavery. And we began meeting in 2016. The second meeting took place at William and Mary. And now it's called Universities Studying Slavery because, as I said earlier, there are schools from the UK that are looking into this, and the Caribbean, and all over the United States. And so I think there was also probably some kind of silent recognition that William and Mary was actually being watched, you know, and so I think that probably also had something to do with our fight for this. Now, I will say also that while from the very beginning, every time the Lemon Project was written about, and there were nasty comments in the comment sections, right? And after a while, I stopped reading those. But we never got a lot of pushback, say from the alums. I kept, every time we would take another step, I kept thinking, okay, is this the moment? And actually right now, this summer, when we started looking at naming and renaming of buildings, that's when we've begun to get the loudest pushback from alums and that type of thing. But actually the memorial, we haven't gotten a lot of pushback
Okay.
at all. So anyway, that's a long answer, which I'm prone to do.
Well, no, thank you. The reason I asked that, and it's partly this my previous question, to just William and Mary, one of the nicknames, my little research, one of the nicknames, it calls itself the alma mater of the nation, because like Jefferson attended there, George Washington even got his surveyor's license, did Madison. I mean, many of those founders and people who, you know, signed the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, you know, were deeply involved. It's the oldest law school in America. I didn't even know that. But so that, and when you combine that, of course, with later the Confederacy in Virginia, that it's that kind of sense of pride, and that, you know, the Lemon Project, you might be disturbing this history. The other piece, though, there are two other pieces I wanted to say. One is about universities and colleges, but also about the Episcopal Church. Although William and Mary today, and it has been since early 20th
century, like 1907, 1908, it's been public.
It became a public university, but it started as a royal charter, and it was founded, a perpetual college of divinity, philosophy, language, and other good arts and sciences. So that actually the England and the Church of England, I'm assuming that this, because I know the chapel there, Anglicanism is deeply rooted in sort of at least the ethos or patina of what the school was, and probably in some ways still is. Father Drew and I both, I think, know the rector of the parish in Williamsburg, Bruton Parish, I think it's called. So, you know, so the Episcopal Church was also deeply engaged in this, of course, and I think the Diocese of Virginia is slowly, I'm saying, started to look at that. But the other piece of it is, and it's two books, and I'm going to just put it up to the side. You can't really see it, but this book, Ebony and Ivy, is about actually how America's universities, all of the Ivy League, schools like William and Mary, schools like the University of North Carolina, and so many places were built on slavery. And that, you know, as universities today need money and donors, they went where the money was, which was from slaveholding. And it didn't matter whether, like Princeton, for example, it would educate ministers who went south to establish churches, but also to make money in slavery, as well as convert slaves into that form of Presbyterianism that Princeton represented. So that, you know, we have a history to grapple with. And sadly, the other book that we had to read this past summer, called Baptized in Blood, about the religion of the lost cause around the Confederacy, that all of the white Christians, denominations in the South, certainly quickly wanted to reverse the history, that yes, we may have lost this war, but we're going to win the peace by developing this idea that slavery was noble. And in fact, yes, the North defeated the South, but the North did not deserve to win the war because they were morally corrupt industrialists And actually, they would also, the South, I think, justifiably say they're just as racist as we are, but they're more hypocritical about it. So this idea of the desire of people like Lincoln and then his successor to make peace with the South, reconciliation, a false reconciliation, without really looking at the issues. They didn't looking at the deep underlying problems. And so the religion of the lost cause, that the denial, which I could say is going on still today, is rooted in this ideology of the lost cause. But this book, Baptized in Blood, says the churches were largely involved in it. And the Episcopal Church gave it the liturgical, as they said, let's say you put a Southern Baptist, a Southern Presbyterian, a Southern Methodist, and a Southern Episcopalian in the room, and you want to have a ceremony to put up a Confederate statue. Well, the person who is the best with words and putting nice, lovely prayers together are who? The people of the Book of Common Prayer. So the Episcopalian would often organize these liturgies to celebrate these statues and other events to celebrate, the Confederate veterans, the Confederate war dead, the daughters of the Confederacy, and so on. And so that this history is really important, but it's going to be painful because this is not to say we're up north in Michigan pointing fingers down at the South. We are all culpable in this issue.
Yeah, and that's part of that miseducation, right? I mean, people are very surprised when they find out that before the Revolution, slavery was a part of the North, right? It was never, like the South became a slave society when they couldn't live without enslaved labor. Their whole economy was based on that. The North was a society with slaves, but they were a society with slaves, and there were significant numbers of enslaved people in the North. And I have had people argue me down at presentations that no, the North was not like that, and that's part of the miseducation.
Yes.
One of the book that the Craig Stephen Wilder book, the Ebony and Ivy, this is one of my favorite, and I think quotes. It says that the Academy never stood apart from American slavery. In fact, it stood beside church and state as the third pillar of a civilization built on bondage. And that's another thing people don't, as you were saying, Father Walter, there's a real resistance to acknowledging that churches own slaves, that in some ways you had churches, early churches, colonial churches in Virginia, trying to figure out how to attract new ministers. And so some of them started offering an enslaved person or an act that was kind of like a perk of the position, was to have an enslaved person, in your household, or someone or the church had the enslaved people who grew the crops that they sold to help pay,
They were part of the glebe. Those who've been in the Washington, D.C. area, you go into Northern Virginia around Alexandria and Arlington, there's a large road throughway called North Glebe Road. Never knew what that was until I was in seminary in church history. The glebe was the payment to the clergy. This was Anglican clergy, that a church wanted a priest. They didn't do tithing. They rented pews maybe. But the way you paid them, well, it comes with a glebe, which is a portion of land that could be farmed. And if you're just speaking of like this clergyman, I'm no farmer, but and probably like a lot of clergy, but the glebe would have enslaved persons in the colonial time to pay for this, to produce. So when people say, why are we as Episcopalians doing this? Well, it's our history and we have to reckon with it. This is how in some ways we became a wealthy church. I mean, I could tell a personal story, but I'm not going to talk much about my own family research into this issue about enslavement, but maybe we'll have time to get to it later.
As you were suggesting, as you talked about Craig Wilder's book, he is talking about the colonial colleges, and it's so important, there is, again, this enduring legacy of slavery. It's so important for us to know about it and to understand it, because it also helps us understand, as Father Walter was saying, the once the English money or outside money started coming, they went to the source of the money, and those were the slave traders. Those were the shipbuilders who were building the slave ships. And so it was a key part of the economy. There was no way this economy would not have functioned without slavery. But again, at the lost cause, all of that got erased, and they started talking about the fact that slaves, they were, the masters were good people, and they were using slavery as a way of civilizing and Christianizing all these terrible, savage pagans, and so really it was a good thing. Weren't they lucky, to have been brought here to find God? And my response to that is that, so God is everywhere but on the continent of Africa, right? He couldn't get to the continent of Africa, so they had to be brought out, and they this notion that this gone with the wind image of slavery, that everybody was happy, they were hard work, they were learning how to work hard, they were being taught all of these things they needed to know. And again, that's the lost cause. But the part of why it's so important for colleges and universities to start being at least a beginning truth teller in this is because we have to correct these stories, and that's where they need to be corrected, right? The colleges and the universities are responsible for educating our leaders, our teachers, our church leaders, that's where it starts, right? And if they continue to get this information that was put in the textbooks, were used in some ways, I don't know, weaponized, I think, in the cause of this new war, this war they were fighting to retell the story of the actual war and the reason for the actual war. So the textbooks will tell you, and some of these textbooks were used into the 70s, right? So even now, as they're maybe getting a tad bit better, but they're still not doing a really good job of really telling the full story, the full US story, which includes the African American story. They're still not doing a great job at that. But if you think about the parents and the grandparents who they heard stories in school, right? And these are the stories they're passing down. These are still some of the stories that you see in public history. And so you have people who don't understand, who develop this line of thinking that, we did these people a favor by bringing them here, and now they want something for nothing, because the churches, not the churches, sorry, we're told that these were lazy people who wouldn't work, who didn't know God, all these problems, and they are biologically inferior, right? And so you have this story fighting against the story that says these were resilient, hardworking people who wanted their freedom, who fought for their freedom, who fought in every war this country has engaged in, who have participated as citizens even when they couldn't vote, even when today they're still trying to take their vote. They're still working. That's the story, the true story. I'm not saying that there's perfection. We just need to know the true story. Because when you have when you're miseducated and you believe the things that you're being taught, that, then you why wouldn't you think these people, how dare they march? They're getting everything, they're being given everything. They've been given everything. That's why the true story and the accurate story is so important to get out there. Okay, so that's, I just slipped into, my father was a Baptist preacher. When I get in a moment like that, I always feel like I'm channeling my
That's great.
dad.
I want to thank you. Thank you. I wanted to invite, it's about 8 past. We've asked a few members, people present, Betsy McCormick, Sue Chaklos, Wendy Richards, and Pamela Blair, if they could join and just give your own responses, or respond, and or questions you might want to have for Jody. And Sue is a retired, and I see her down there, is a retired educator. So we've actually had this conversation about in Ohio. I grew up in Ohio, and it was not, I didn't get anything near the truth about the Civil War, slavery, or anything like that.
May I respond? Am I coming through?
Certainly, Betsy. Yeah. Please, yes.
Dr. Allen, Betsy McCormick, and nice to meet you, and a fellow alum of a fine MSU. Oh. Congratulations. I wish I'd been a history major. I was not. But my career in social work, obviously, I think as a therapist, much of the work that we do both socially and individually is trying to help individuals and communities undo misinformation as it has impacted their lives in so many ways. And so I have a great personal interest in the undoing of misinformation, and I appreciate that very much. I'll leave that at that. I'm also very interested in colonial history in the United States, which I am told by my peers in education that it's pretty much a subject that is now left to maybe 1 or 2 hours in perhaps the 4th or 5th grade, which I find very sad. And of course, until Hamilton, the play came out, most people had no recollection, history, interest in that subject. I am reminded also of the director of the Smithsonian, unfortunately I'm blanking on his name, who is a fine scholar of history, and he and a number of national organizations, including one that I'm a member of, the National Society of Colonial Dames of America, which sounds like a very la-di-da group, and they are. I won't throw that away. But there is a great movement on the part of volunteers and interested Americans to begin to really research very significant history in Virginia, particularly to find women, which would be part of our organization, who really contributed to the founding of this country. And that's what the Colonial Dames were all about. They are very close to finding some people who are in that category. I'm excited about it. I don't know a lot of research yet. You may know infinitely more than I. And then my final comment is I recently read a novel about the fine state of New York during colonial times, 1746 particularly, a novel or a book that was written by a man by the name of Francis Buford, and it's called Golden Hill. And I'm going to put it up. He has a very interesting subject matter. It is a novel, and it's a little bit dicey and saucy at times, but it gives you a beginning struggle history of the conflict, both in the North and the South, but particularly in New York, of what was going on at that time in New York. And all I'm saying is that the misinformation is a subject that we are all struggling with. Nationally, politically, we have just been through, in my personal opinion, humble as it may be, a great time of misinformation, which for those of us who are trying to be sane and sensible and contributing, it's been a very painful time. But thank you for your contributions and what you're doing for your your stake in the history of these stories. Thank you so much.
Yeah, there's actually at William and Mary, there's a scholarship. The Colonial Dames sponsor a scholarship in the history department.
I am aware of that.
Okay.
And part of that is part of that history. Thank you for mentioning that. But some of us
Sue?
were also Northerners. That's some of us have to say that just because.
You want me to talk?
Please go ahead, Sue. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sue. I just retired teaching at a Title I school within Grosse Pointe, and extremely frustrated with the lack of good history that I was raised. I was a graduate of that other school in Ann Arbor.
You know that was going to come up.
I know, eventually it had to.
But I'm married to an MSU grad and have one child that went there. And a couple things that really struck. First of all, I grew up in context with my grandmother around the block, and who was raised by a grandmother who was part of the Confederacy, and it obviously had kind of a different story told. And really, I really appreciate the history you're doing. It's like this was in North Carolina, and so I'm very motivated to try and find more of our family history. I do know that there is slave owners in it, but not quite sure what that all entailed. And I'm very fascinated with the process of putting the memorial up at Bruton on the grounds. My son's an architect, and it was just fascinating on what you had to go through to get that. And I'd be curious to hear what kinds of programs are being done at northern universities looking at this slave issue, as because we the northern us people in the north are raised that that's the South issue. And I was very much aware that that was not true. Having families that came, I mean, one of the interesting things in my family is on my dad's side is that they were homesteaders in Michigan, and so the huge conflict. One of the things is a great grandmother was the first non-Indian, non-Indigenous person born in Eden County, and so I really would love to know more what's going on with some of our northern schools as far as looking at those kinds of things. And it was, and the other part was interesting was talking with your. I have an uncle, a great uncle, who was an artist in New Mexico, and his subject was basically the indigenous people down there. And he has a huge mural at the University of New Mexico Library, where they created a class to find out what to do with it, because this mural does depict white supremacy. And so I've been following that over the last 2 years. So it's kind of interesting, hearing your story. And so thank you for coming to us today.
Sure, thank you for having me. Yeah. I would say there are schools, Princeton has started to look at its history. Some of these schools, I will say too, that they are faculty and students began the research, because you can't, most institutions don't tell their faculty what they can research or not.
Oh, true.
And so in some instances, it's kind of coming up from that regard, like faculty are writing and talking about what's, the history of the schools. And then grudgingly, the administration is kind of, coming on board. And so my alma mater is actually, I was on a panel in September. Delaware is starting to look at its history with slavery and also Native American, because we're all pretty much on their land. I mean, William and Mary is on the land of Native Americans, Delaware also, and Yale and Harvard there've been kind of spots, I think, of here and there. Harvard just joined universities studying slavery. There's been some real some real resistance there. I'd say MIT, where Craig Wilder is, they are doing this work. So yeah, it's definitely happening in the North. And if you want to, the University of Virginia's, if you put in University of Virginia and slavery, you'll come up with the USS, University Studying Slavery link, and you can see all of the schools that are currently in the USS.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, Wendy's here. She had to get, thank you, Wendy. I knew she had to get batteries.
Yeah. So thanks for the delay. Sorry about that. So thanks so much for talking to us. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I'm actually a graduate of the University of Virginia. So yeah, definitely familiar with the attachment to history. And
Wendy, you're muted. You muted yourself.
can you hear
There
me now?
you are.
There we are.
Now we can hear you. Yes,
Okay,
thank
so
you.
I just was saying that I am a graduate of the University of Virginia, so very familiar with the difficult acceptance of the, pretty ugly history that also went with, so much of the success of that school, and how we unpack that, I think is really so important if we ever want to move forward. I was really touched by your statement of the fact that we're still really dealing with the damage that's happened as being a society dependent on a slave economy, that we can't ignore it. Like, that has to be something that we deal with head on if we ever want to heal. And so much of that is dealing with it from these areas of prestige like universities. So so thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much for pushing, Williamsburg and William and Mary to accept this, because without those efforts, you're right, they'll be marginalized. So the fact that you're putting it at the forefront is really important. And also, I'm really grateful as, a parent of, 2 children who will be going to university someday, hopefully, that we are changing this conversation and accepting that this is a reality, that this is part of academics, this is part of this world that we've kind of idolized for so long, and that we have to really look at how all of us have benefited from this, and how we can really work to recognize all those folks that were ignored and nameless for so long. And so I want to thank you, and I love the fact that you're also including the names in the project itself, because they deserve to have recognition as human beings. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy. If anyone else wants to say something, please chime in, or we encourage you also to put something in the chat section. I have one more question to give to Professor Allen, and then because I dropped something earlier as sort of a clue, I would like to share something before we conclude. But Jody, have you, in getting the names that you're able to get, were you able to trace any descendants of those enslaved persons who might still be, the descendants who are living today?
Yeah, well, yes. Let me take that part back. We are working on trying to find those people. We, almost from the beginning, we got questions or comments from people in the community saying that they think they're a descendant of either someone who was on the plantation, or someone who was on the actual campus in Williamsburg. But we didn't have the we didn't have the people. Initially, there was myself, a graduate fellow who is an ABD working on their doctorate, and then a graduate student the second year. And so there just wasn't the personnel to get that done. Last year, William and Mary got a Mellon grant, and our part of that Mellon grant is a postdoc And I'm happy to say we were able to hire him in spite of COVID, get him. And he is a large part of what he is doing is that research to figure out if we can trace people, which we believe that we can. We will be able to do that. But we're just starting that work. So to look for descendants of people that enslaved by William and Mary. But also we're also working in the community to teach people how to do their own genealogies, their own family research. So yeah, but that's, I think that's very important. You know, up until now, we've really treated the larger African American community as the descendant community in terms of when we have, you know, we held community forums to talk about the memorial before, you know, when we were going through that process. And so it's been important to us from the beginning to connect with the community. But it would be awesome to be able to connect with, you know, direct descendants if we could find that out. So, yeah.
Thank you. I want to get Father Drew. I don't know why he hadn't jumped in before, but if he could get, Father Drew could get in. There he is.
Well, thank you, Walter. And before I jump in, you mentioned that you wanted to share something. So let's hear what you
well,
had on your mind.
This is, you know, part of the conversation, and this is not a discussion per se about reparations, but part of that conversation is about the legacy today of slavery, which is another 3-hour conversation. But one personal story that my father and other relatives talk about. There is probably those who remember the early days, meaning the 1990s, of computers and the internet, remember that there was a web browser called Netscape, and it actually eventually, it sued Microsoft, and it eventually got merged into AOL, which also doesn't exist. But the chief executive officer of Netscape was a man, he's still living, James Barksdale. And James Barksdale is a Mississippian named after another James Barksdale of a prominent landowning Mississippi family. And that James Barksdale, who is the name of the one that the James Barksdale who's still living, was my grandfather, my paternal grandfather's, basically the Brownridges lived on that plantation at one time owned by the Barksdales and later as sharecroppers on the Barksdale. And not only that, but my grandmother, my father's mother, both the Barksdales and the Brownridges were very close. And I could get into a lot of story there, but I won't. But what is interesting to me when we talk about that, Jim Barksdale is actually a wonderful man. I've never met him, but what I read about him, he's a great philanthropist. He's probably close to a billionaire, and an honorable man. But what is interesting to me is that his forebearers, his ability in life with a college degree from the University of Mississippi to rise in corporate and then eventually be a CEO and quite wealthy and now a philanthropist in his 70s, is in some ways a result of that slave economy that Mississippi was built on. And that when I think about the number of enslaved and then later even sharecroppers who never, you know, that kind of wealth which came from land gave an advantage to some people. It's not that, you know, we sometimes talk about the rags to riches executive or entrepreneur, but as often is the case, these are individuals who maybe had something that might have been more of a hidden leg up in society. And I just always, you know, marvel, you know, if someone asks me, well, how did slavery really affect you or hurt you? And it says, well, my grandfather, when he died, He actually died with 300 acres of land that a lawyer swindled my grandmother and my father and his two brothers out of. I mean, the reality of racism and the privileges that a landowning class of whites would have was different than even a Black person who managed to, in his life, buy land. It's, structural racism, I like to describe, is a down escalator for Black people as well as others, indigenous and others who suffer. It's a down escalator. And when people love to talk about, well, you have to be self-disciplined, personal responsibility, what you're really saying is teaching a person how to develop the legs and the cardiovascular system to run up a down escalator. When I was young, I could run up a down escalator. I can't do that now. And some people will never be able to do that. And I'm just thinking, in the society that we describe, when we want to talk about ending systemic racism, we actually have to truly, make it a system where that kind of reality, a down escalator for many people, is eliminated. And part of that is recognizing the legacy of slavery has in the impact of how wealth in America has been distributed. So that's just my little vignette on that.
That's a huge, wonderful subject. Wonderful. And am I being heard?
You are.
I don't know. Betsy's talking. There I am. Hello. Well, Walter, that's right. I think the down escalator for many is a challenge, both for families and history. I'm reminded what I'm rather excited about. First of all, I'm delighted by the dialogue, and that we're, as you suggested in your early remarks, Dr. Allen, we're opening up the subject, and that's fabulous. It's like a nice piece of controlled surgery, I'm hoping. That's never a big joyful experience, however. I'm also reminded once again in my own personal history, my family came from early Connecticut in the 1600s. And I am privileged to have a will written by a woman who was my great something or other grandmother, let's call her. And in that will, when women had no rights and no vote and no anything really other than cooking, and I still enjoy doing that, but her will was fabulous. The sons in that family, of course, inherited the land, Walter. They were apparently millers of some sort during those days. But what impressed me so was that she was valued enough that she had a will. And her will, it makes me weep in some ways when I think of the humility of this. Her gifts were very simple. She gave her blue apron, which had great value. And my son, who was a history major, reminded me, probably because it had been dyed with indigo, which was a huge trade value during those times. And her other gift to her daughter, that was to one of her daughters, and her other gift in her will was her mixing bowl. Those were her legacies to her family, or to her, particularly her daughters, since her sons inherited the greater part of the land that they owned. But I'm saying this because maybe we can find joy in learning more about American history. The tough part of that, I think, in contemporary time is you have to be a reader. And I'm not sure that with all that's going on with fast communication and instant telling of this and that, it's something that takes a great deal of time. But our histories are so important, both on a national level and a racial level. And Detroit has its own fascinating, marvelous, but painful history. I just want to commend everybody to the museum downtown, the African American Museum. I don't know if you've been there, Dr. Allen.
Yes.
I had the privilege of going there with the then Dean of the National Cathedral. And he and I spent a morning there taking a look at that. We just need to continue the journey of learning and undoing in the best way we can, even in our own small circles. Keep telling our own stories, some of which are not necessarily positive. But I commend you for your work. I hope you continue. It's a big challenge, but one that is terribly worthy. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you too, Walter.
Well, thank you, Betsy. And my apologies, Father Drew. Maybe I misspoke. I thought I had said your name to come in, but my fault. Thank you for getting in. Please go ahead, because you haven't had a chance really to ask Professor any questions or observations.
Well, Jody, first of all, thank you for opening our eyes to not only the work of the Lemon Project, but to the history behind it, critical history for us to explore. And I'm struck by a bit of the conversation we've had, but also a little ringing in my ears. My kids are of a certain age. My son's a sixth grader and beginning to ask, why do I have to learn this? Whether it's why do I have to learn this subject in math or whatnot? And it's a reminder, particularly in this conversation, that history isn't just about information of the past. It shapes, I believe, it shapes who we are. And the work of the Lemon Project, it seems to me, and I'd love your perspective on this, seems to be more than just uncovering the past, but addressing some shall I say, failures, and as we've been kind of dancing around today, the legacy of the past and its impacts today. And so I would love to hear from your perspective why the Lemon Project is so important. Not just, I don't, the word just is the wrong word. On the one hand, it is recovering the past, and bringing to our consciousness that the history and the names of individuals whose lives were devastated, shall I say, by the institution of slavery. And yet I think the Lemon Project is also addressing something for us today. And I'd love to hear from you why it's such a critical part of your work and the community of William and Mary. What is the legacy that the Lemon Project is addressing and perhaps correcting today?
Well, no, I completely agree with you that uncovering, and this is something I say to my students, I mean, we need to study history, not just because, of course, it's interesting, knowing how people lived, what they did, but it's also crucial to addressing today's issues. It's directly, I mean, a lot of times I think I'm trying to get my thoughts together here. When people say to me, oh, I don't know how you could teach history. I hated history. That's more often than not. They hated history. But it's because I think they learned it through memorization, right? They memorized names, they memorized dates, and then they put them on tests. They wrote the answers in. But they didn't talk about how and why something happened, and so you don't really learn the circumstances and how those circumstances can happen again, right? There's nothing to say, because the saying, history repeats itself. I've had, many professors that said, no, history doesn't repeat itself. What repeats itself, though, are the personality types in every generation. So if you have greedy people who want power, or caring, loving people, all of those things repeat. And people who have power want to maintain that power, right? For whatever reason, if they think it's honestly belongs to them, or they want to be able to control the situation around them. And so, and those things lead to some of the ugly things we see in history. So, you can't say, I've had, people, you hear people say, when we were talking about, recent times, in this country, well, that could never happen here. Or it could only, it may have happened in other places, but it could never happen here. Well, if you understand your history, you know that there were people here who had these thoughts before, and wanted to control or change the Constitution in ways that disfranchised people, that harmed people, that removed people who were different. All of that has happened. That kind of thing happens, and it happens repeatedly. So understanding it, so you recognize it and you can address it. That's one of the reasons it's so important to study history. I mean, and I think at William and Mary, just back in when there were no students of color, Black or anyone on campus, and if there were Black people always there from day one, but they were serving people. But when those students walk around campus and they see James Monroe, Thomas Jefferson, James Blair, Lord Botetourt. I don't know why he's the only Englishman still there, but anyway, he's there. You see John Tyler, all of these people, and these are the people who are revered, the important people. Their portraits are everywhere, their statues are there, but they don't see anybody that suggests to them, you belong here too. There were people here like you who were important in different ways. And so I think it's important when we talk about the campus landscape that we learn about that, and then we learn why we need to make those changes, so that when people argue with us about, when students want to remove the Jefferson statue or the Monroe statue or whoever, or a portrait or whatever, that there's some understanding as to why that might be the case, right? So you don't have this group of Black students over here saying, you need to remove that, or that flag is offensive, and then you don't have them saying that, and then you have white students who don't know the story, who are saying, well, they just hate our history. That's our history. So that's part of our heritage. So that's why William and Mary's story in particular, but all of these stories need to be told. So,
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just going to comment on the people who don't read. There are other ways to get that history, but I can do that.
Go. We're much more interested in hearing from you.
Well, no, I just wanted to, because I see someone who talked about documentaries, and there are some really well done. There's some really good podcasts. And now, if you're into just listening, there are a lot of academic texts and more history on even Craig Stephen Wilder, the book that Father Walter mentioned. You can listen to that on Audible. So if you don't want to, and of course, as an old nerd, I don't want to turn people away from the book, but if there's other ways you can get that exact same book on Audible and listen to it, and there are other books out there on slavery, race, and reconciliation on Audible. So anyway, that's a little commercial.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your comment and exploration, for instance, of the images and statues that are found on the campus there at William and Mary, as a reminder that the history, however it's told, whether it's history books or portraits on a wall or statues in a garden, history recounts our values. And one of the most devastating legacy of slavery, of the genocide of indigenous peoples in America, is the devaluation of their contributions, essential contributions to our life. And so to see the Lemon Project come to life, shall we say, at William and Mary is from my vantage, an affirmation of all of the profound contributions that were made by humble Black men and women 300 years ago to building up what is a fine and institution of education, but also our nation, alongside the likes of Jefferson and Madison and Tyler. I mean, their voice and their contribution is as significant, as meritorious of these others that we have long remembered and valued.
One of the things I talk, we found in the record, the types of tasks that the enslaved people did, and I said, they're the people who made Jefferson and Monroe's and Madison's and Tyler's lives livable on that campus. They chopped the wood and made sure the classrooms and the student rooms had wood. They carried water twice a day to the student rooms. They painted, they repaired, they cleaned the shoes. And colonial Virginia, colonial Williamsburg, well, it was just Williamsburg then. There were no paved roads, but there were lots of pigs and cows and oxen, and I said, they cleaned the shoes that the students wore. They cleaned the stables. They took care of the animals. They grew the food. So without that, would these founding fathers have had the time to sit and think about the things they thought about and later put into practice, So.
Well, I can't thank you enough for this time with us to explore the legacy of slavery that we are still facing as an American people in each of our communities. One of the things that we've done to end all of our conversations is to invite you this week, but to invite our speaker to offer a last thought, something you would like us to take away from our conversation or to explore as we continue our sacred conversation. So I want to just invite you, Jody, to offer for us what is it you would like us to hold on to or to continue in our exploration on this important conversation?
Well, one of the things that I say to my students, definitely at the end of the semester, but probably during the semester too, is that because I find that guilt seems to be a real issue for white people, right? And in terms of dealing with this issue, that I didn't do anything, I didn't benefit or whatever, or just shame if they did. And one of the things I say to my students is that none of us in this room is responsible for anything that happened in the past. But once we know better, then we must do better, right? We work from here to make a difference. We can't fix anything from back there, but we work from here, and that's what we need to focus on. So that's.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I pray that we as a community here at Christ Church will continue that good work to pick up where we are and to continue to make our community, our society, and our common future better, not just for ourselves, but for our neighbors well beyond us. And so, Jody, thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you. For leading us in this sacred conversation. And I hope you are seeing all of the hands being clapped around to offer you our thanks and our gratitude today.
Thank you all very much. It was a pleasure to be here, and I thank you for the invitation.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Father Drew, can I just mention, I know you're going to probably say we're off until January 10, the next time we gather for sacred conversations. Could I just mention something a little bit about the speaker for that January 10?
Sure.
So the next time we gather in the new year, we will be learning the Latinx, Latino Hispanic story, and the Reverend Nancy Frosto, who is an Episcopal priest in Los Angeles, She is a dreamer, a DACA dreamer, and an incredible story. She serves on the staff of St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Long Beach now. And she's a leading person in the Diocese of Los Angeles on immigrant rights and working on that. And she's a millennial, and she's the first person ordained in the Episcopal Church who was raised up from childhood to adulthood and into ordination in a Spanish-speaking congregation there in Los Angeles. So, so after we have a nice Christmas break, we look forward to seeing you back here on January 10.
Fantastic. Well, a last word of thanks, and that is my thanks to Walter for helping to organize our sacred conversations to help make these dialogues and conversations possible. So, Father, thank you for introducing us to Jody, and to and in the future to introducing us to our future speakers throughout this year. Friends, thank you all for joining us this morning. I'll stick around. I'm sure Father Walter will stick around for some of the natural chit chat that follows our forums, shall we say. And again, Jody, on behalf of Christ Church, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jody. Take care.